Hey there, welcome to Who and What I Think is the Top 5 People and Events in the War of 1812. My name is Joshua and I will be your host for the entire video. Commonly known as the Forgotten War, the War of 1812 took place right in between the American Revolution and American Civil War. However, many people don't realize that the War of 1812 is actually what shaped Canada and the United States to what it is today. Without further ado, let's start the countdown with the top 5 events in the War of 1812. Coming in at number 5 is also known as the Battle that Saved Canada, or more commonly known as Battle of Crysler's Farm. Fought on the 11th of November 1813 along the shores of the St. Lawrence River, the Americans were heavily favored for they had far more soldiers than the British, with the Americans having 8,000 regulars and the British having 900 regulars and militia. Fortunately for the British, their army was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Morrison. Morrison was smart and took advantage of the landscape during the fight. While the American artillery did have a devastating effect, they were unable to overcome the well-coordinated efforts of British artillery and musketry, or their bayonets. I picked this event for number 5 mainly because it was an event that many people don't realize was one of the main reasons why the US weren't able to claim much land of Canada. Many people seem to forget that if it weren't for the Battle of Crysler's Farm and the Battle of Chateauguay, the United States would have claimed much of Upper Canada and Lower Canada, causing the war to turn out much more differently than it would have. With the campaign of 1813 by the US being a failure, this gave the British the chance to bring in more soldiers from Europe. At number 4 is the sacking of York, or the capture of York, a crushing defeat for the British in the War of 1812. The sacking of York began on the morning of 27th of April 1813. With a flotilla of 16 American ships making its way to the capital of Upper Canada, the Americans easily got past the small group of warriors defending the shore. Around 1,700 American men took control, and the British General Sir Roger Hale retreated and left behind 2 local militia officers to negotiate terms of surrender. All valuables were destroyed, the naval stores were destroyed, and most importantly, the Parliament and Government House were set on fire. This event was picked for number 4 because the Americans thought of this event as an important political victory. It also showed that the Americans were capable of doing things they said they would do. This event was also a big boost to the Americans for military and civilian morale because of following couple months of ineffective campaigning. The Americans, coming in as an underdog, showed that they meant business, but the British weren't going to sit there and take it, which takes us to the capture of Washington. The Battle of Bladensburg was a major victory for the British during the War of 1812. It took place at Bladensburg, Maryland in August 1814. British forces under Major General Robert Ross routed the American army led by General William Winder. The outcome allowed British soldiers to occupy nearby Washington, D.C., the United States capital. When the British reached the capital, most of the city's residents had fled. British soldiers looted the White House and set it aflame. They also burned the Capitol, which housed the Library of Congress and other public buildings. I picked this event for the number 3 slot mainly because it showed that the British weren't going to sit there and take the torching of York silently. This event had a big impact to even today because it was the main reason why the White House is the color it is presently. This event also showed that the British were ruthless when it came to retaliation and would do anything to win the war. At number 4 is the Battle of the Thames River. The Battle of Thames River was an important American victory and took place in October 1813 along the Thames River in what is now Ontario, Canada. United States Major General William Henry Harrison led the American Army of the Northwest against the combined British and Indian force. With the British soldiers fleeing early in the battle, Indian forces suffered many losses, such as the loss of their leader, Tecumseh. This event was important to the outcome of the war because it ruined any chances of the First Nations getting what they wanted out of the war. The death of Tecumseh broke the League of Indian Tribes that had been allied to the British. This ended any hopes of the First Nations getting what they wanted from fighting the war in the beginning. Finally, at number 5 is the Treaty of Ghent, signed on Christmas Eve 1814. Negotiations for peace had begun the previous year because the military situation in North America was just so balanced. When the word of the treaty was sent back to North America, there already was a big battle that occurred after the treaty was signed. The Battle of New Orleans, won by General Andrew Jackson, was known as one of the spectacular US victories of the war. Although the treaty said nothing about 2 of the key issues that started the war, the rights of neutral US vessels and the impressments of US sailors, it did open up the Great Lakes region to American expansion and was hailed as a diplomatic victory in the United States. This is the most important event of the war because it is one of the main reasons why the War of 1812 became known as the Forgotten War. None of the reasons why the war started was reached. All captured territory in Upper and Lower Canada and the US was returned to its original owner. There was nothing included on neutral rights or impressment. This event is what shaped the war to be what it is known as today. Now that we have looked at the top 5 events of the war, let's look at the people that really influenced the way the war was fought. At number 5 is Andrew Jackson, a major general in the US Army during the War of 1812 and later served as the 7th President of the United States. As a general in the Tennessee State Militia, he defeated the Creek Indians in 1814. During the War of 1812, Jackson was appointed a major general and sent to New Orleans to prepare the city's defenses against an impending British attack. His Army of Tennessee and Kentucky Volunteers defeated an invading British force of 7,500 men and forced the British to withdraw from the region. The political future of the hero of New Orleans was secured by this victory. Andrew Jackson is number 5 on my list because he was one of the most important generals on the American side that had a strong impact and influence on not only his army, but the whole country. Charles de Salaberry is best known for helping repel against a large-scale attack by the Americans in the Battle of Chateauguay in the October of 1813. He set up an illusion that there were a lot more Canadian forces than there actually was to confuse the Americans, sort of like the capture of Detroit. It worked in his favor and the Americans backed off, tired and discouraged. Before the war broke out in 1812, Charles de Salaberry helped raise a unit of militia to help defend Lower Canada, which he did. Without his cleverness and tactics, Lower Canada would have been invaded by the overwhelming amount of American soldiers and changed the war's outcome, which is why he was chosen for the number 4 slot. At the 3rd place slot is the heroine Laura Secord. Laura Secord's house was occupied by American troops when she heard their plans to surprise attack the British outpost at Beaver Dams and capture the officer in charge, Lieutenant James Fitzgibbon. Because her husband was injured, Laura Secord went on a journey to deliver this news by herself. Worried she'll be caught by American guards, she went around the roads through the forests and trees where she finally arrived to deliver the news. 2 days later, American troops were ambushed by First Nation warriors and captured. The American forces were eventually forced to surrender. Laura Secord is in the 3rd place spot because being one of the only, if not only, heroines of the war, she has made a big impact to history, showing that even though women didn't have as many rights as right now back then, they still had the capability of saving a country just as much as the next man. Without the help of Laura Secord, the war would have probably not have gone the way it should have when the Americans were going to surprise attack the Canadians. And finally, for the number 2 spot, I give it to Tecumseh. Tecumseh, a Shawnee chief and leader that opposed American territorial expansion, was the spirit and soul of the First Nations will at the time. Being well known for helping deceiving the Americans during the capture of Detroit, his tactical decisions in the sieges of Fort Meigs and Fort Stephenson helped the war against the Americans immensely. His last battle, the Battle of the Thames River, he was killed in a final stand against the invading Americans. Tecumseh, like General Isaac Brock, was a big symbol towards not only the First Nations but also towards the Americans. Tecumseh represented what the First Nations wanted and what they could do to reach that goal to get what's rightfully theirs. Many respected Tecumseh, and it was even reported that Brock gave him his sash as a mark of respect. Through Tecumseh, the British and First Nations allied against the Americans, and it was through the death of Tecumseh that alliance broke. Tecumseh's image has a big impact even today to show the First Nations' power and will. If it weren't for Tecumseh, the First Nations wouldn't have had as much impact that they had during the war. Unfortunately, the reason why the First Nation fought in the first place wouldn't reach its goal in the end. Coming in at the number 1 spot is Major General Isaac Brock. Upon his arrival, Brock made an aggressive campaign against the Americans, even though his superiors told him to stay on the defensive. His tactics paid off when Brock and Tecumseh created the illusion that they had a larger army than they actually did, causing the capture of Detroit. Though Brock was shot and killed during the Battle of Queenston Heights, the image of his leadership and influence helped the British forces and First Nation warriors to drive back the Americans and preserve Upper Canada. His death boosted the morale in Upper Canada for most of the war. His most famous words upon his death, "Push on, brave York Volunteers," has influenced many during the war. Without Isaac Brock, the province would have definitely fallen to the US. Because of these reasons, he is ranked number 1 on my top 5 people in the War of 1812. Thanks for watching this video, and again, this is just my opinion on the top 5 events and people in the War of 1812. If you have any thoughts or suggestions about the top 5, be sure to comment down below. All sources can be found in the description below. In which case, I hope you enjoyed this video, and have a great day.